What's up, y'all? This is going to be a yappy video about the new Talon models. I've done a bunch of research, pulled it together for you in an Excel chart as usual, and tried to talk through it not super fast, but get you all the information, and I'll not make the video too long. Unfortunately, there aren't parts diagrams out for the new 2023 R models yet, and that's where I usually get a lot of my good stuff from, is digging through part numbers and cross-referencing them. As soon as they come out, I will make an update to this video, and I'll be able to figure out exactly what components on the suspension are common between the 22 and the 23. But this is what I can tell from the specs. I think I do have some good information for you here. At the end of the video, I have a kind of a revelation. I think Honda was a little lazy, but you'll have to wait and figure out what that is. All right, guys, so this video is a long overdue, but the Honda new models are starting to trickle out, and I'm getting some questions from my buddies about them, and I'm also looking at getting one myself. So I want to make a video about the updates to the Honda Talon platform. So as usual, we'll start with the documentation from Honda. This is from their media newsroom. This is what's new for 2023. They talk about the history. We don't really care about that. We know that. Um, and here's their bullet points. What's new? So the biggest thing I was talking about is there is now a wide four-seater version, the R-4. So you get that extra stability, which the four-seaters need because they're taller in the back, and I've seen plenty of them flip over. And you get the extra suspension travel, and you get the bigger shocks up front. You finally get the 2.5s in the front. So that's pretty cool for the four-seater gang, the family guys. Also, the other thing everyone's talking about is the new 2023 Talon R is 2.7 inches shorter. I think this was a weird move, but they said they did it to decrease the obnoxious turning radius, which was the big complaint. Honda's always listening, so that's good. I wish they'd have kept it the same length or made it longer and just given us a sharper steering angle, but they don't want to do that for some reason. I'm sure they have good reasons, like people flipping over and stability. But anyways, that's a big one. Full coverage doors, who cares? Storage compartment in the doors, who cares? New power steering unit. This is a big one. So this is the same power steering unit or a similar one to that's in my 2022 Pioneer 1000, and it is an excellent power steering unit. The return to center feels very natural. You just get a lot of feedback, and it's also stronger for putting big mud tires. This is also a big one. New ignition mapping. So the old Talon's a big complaint, especially with the shorter drivers, like my friend Chrissy. Your foot bounces off the throttle and it can be very jerky. Some people put a heel brace, some people just deal with it, but they've made the ignition mapping more smooth. So that's a big improvement. Again, Honda's always listening. Accessories are easier, new stylish aluminum wheels, new sidewalls on the tires. I've actually blown out some stock Talon tire sidewalls, so this is great that they're putting a little beefier sidewalls. Sorry, Chrissy. And new colors and new accessories. Okay, so that's all really cool. But what didn't they tell us here? There's one thing they didn't mention. So the models that are coming out for 2023 that are going to be non-live valve, those haven't actually been released yet. We'll talk about that in a minute. They're not on the website yet, but we know they're coming. And they're going to have different shocks on them. They're not going to have the Fox QS3s. They're actually going to have some Showa shocks with new valving. And I'm hoping this is going to improve the wide quality because the Talons have always been kind of choppy in the rear, and they've always kind of lawn darted when you jumped them. So hopefully these new Showa shocks and the non-live valves will be a big improvement. I don't know when we're going to see those models. We're about to go through the models on the website, and you'll see that for 2023, there's no live valves there's no non-live valves listed other than the XS. So that's where it gets more confusing. Now there's this whole list of XS models, and some people are confused by that. What does that mean? Let me go to one. So you see it's a 1000 XS4. All this S means is that it's the 2022. And the 2022 had a slight facelift and stuff like that, but 2022 is really the same suspension that the Talon's always had since 2019. So you can think of the S as meaning the old school model. So this is going to be like your slightly outdated budget model. Honda did this just because they wanted to keep the production numbers up while they were trying to transition to a new model and give you a cheaper option. And the only way to get a non-live valve right now is to get an XS. If you look in here, there's still a non-live valve option. But if you look at all these new models like the R, for instance, you only get the live valve option. So that's a big takeaway right there is if you don't want live valve and you want a 2023, so far you got to get an XS, which means you're really buying a 2022. Okay, now of course I made a spreadsheet, so let me pull that over because that is a convenient way to go through a lot of stuff at once. I did not put any of the live valve S models in here, so this is going to be 2023s all the way across, comparing the new one, the R, with the older one, the RS, for instance. The only thing missing from this chart, to say it again, is the RS live valve. I didn't put it in there because it just confuses the chart, and the numbers are the same for the most part. So I'm just going to walk you through this chart, and you can feel free to pause the video and go through it yourself if you're looking at comparing these models. These are the main specs that have changed, so I try to put them all into one chart. So turning radius is a big thing everyone's talking about for 2023. Let's ignore this guy for now because it's a bastardization, right? You can't really do a comparison because there's never a four-seater R before. So we'll get to that at the end, but let's focus on these guys for now. Oh no, I messed it all up. Let's focus on the models that we had for 2022 because then we can do a comparison. So again, if it says XS, you can really call that a 22 because that's what the S means. Okay, so really what we're comparing here is 23 suspension to 22 suspension. Um, so the big thing, the X4 is pretty much the same, right? We got the same wheelbase. The weight went up a good bit. Ground clearance is the same, but again, remember this is live valve. So all of these 23s that are available now, I'm going to put a live valve above them because right now you cannot buy a new style non-live valve, which is disappointing because I'm not a big live valve fan. Once you put big tires on there, you kind of mess the suspension up anyways, so why pay the extra money for this premium suspension if you're going to dork it up regardless? So this is live valve, so that might be some of the extra weight there, but the width's the same. The front travel is a little different, and that is actually because of the live valve. If you look at the 22 live valve, it's the same travel, and that goes over here with the non-four-seater as well. So these X models have the smaller Fox 2.0 front shocks, and when you go to live valve, you lose 0.2 inches of front travel. So that's another reason not to do live valve, in my opinion. But anyways, one thing that's interesting here is that going from 2022 to 2023, the X4's turning radius got larger and all the other numbers are the same. So we can only really assume that they changed the power steering rack. Maybe this change is to allow incorporating the new power steering motor, but it looks like they changed the rack geometry. Or the knuckle geometry. Those are really the only two things that could have changed there. Every other number is the same, so that's interesting that the turning radius got worse on the 23. Especially when you consider that Honda put a bunch of effort into making the turning radius better for the 23 on the other models. So, all right, so let's switch over to talking about the 2023 R. And this is a big change. So the suspension is totally different on the 2023 R than the 22. The front and rear control arms, probably the axles are different. Some big changes here. And what they did was they reduced the rake going forward and backwards. So this thing used to have really raked forward front arms and really raked rear arms. You could look at the axles and tell they were raked. They removed some of that rake to shorten the wheelbase and improve the turning radius. So you can see the turning radius is down by 2 feet and the wheelbase is down by 2.7 inches. So that's a pretty big change. We'll talk about more a little bit later in the video. So just a side note here, I don't know what was raked back more, the front or the rear, but if Honda raked back the front arms, it could affect tire clearance on the 2023 R. So you won't be able to run 35 stock, most likely. Going to improve ride and turning radius. It definitely improved turning radius. We'll see if it improves the ride. In general, people think the Hondas ride bad because they're so much shorter than the Can-Ams. So making it even shorter, you're probably not going to have great high-speed performance in the ride. Whatever. They also made the R a little narrower. So it used to be 68.4, now it's 68.1. So when they changed the suspension and raked everything back, they also made it a little narrower. And that's also probably contributing to helping the turning radius because you don't have a differential in the back. So the wider you are, the more the back tires are fighting you being able to turn. Suspension travel, it's the same in the rear. We lost 0.1 inches in the front. Maybe that's due to the shock changes, or maybe that's due to making the suspension a little narrower. I'm not 100% sure. Ground clearance is about the same, and curb weight is pretty close. Again, the biggest weight difference here is this is a non-live valve, this is a live valve. Let's look at the Talon X. This is my favorite model. I've had the R and the X. I like the X because it had better turning radius and it was a little narrower for fitting between tight trees and stuff. And then when you put portals, it keeps the width more manageable. They didn't change much for the X. So you can see turning radius is the same, wheelbase is the same, weight's different, but again, live valve versus non-live valve. Ground clearance, slight change, but that's just live valve versus non-live valve, the different springs. Width's the same. Suspension would be the same, except it's live valve versus non-live valve, so you lose 0.2 inches in the front. I already said that for the X4. And the rear travel is the same. So they didn't change much on the X. Now, what I'm excited about is once they release a non-live valve 2023X, it'll have those Showa shocks. It'll hopefully be better than the Fox QS3s. I've really never loved the QS3s on anything I've owned. Um, so looking forward to those models dropping. That may be what I go with, but I'll probably have to test out the new R because it's got more changes, and I like to test out the newest thing with the most changes because it gets more views and it gets you guys more data. Okay, now what everyone's talking about, let's talk about this big boy right here. So this is the new 2023 R-4. Everyone wanted it. People were already doing mods to convert their X4s into R-4s because the X4 is so tippy. If you're a family guy and you got your kids in the back, you really don't want to flip over. But they're tippy because the back seats are up a little higher, the back roll cage is up really high, and these things like to flip over. I've seen a ton of them flip over in the water, a couple of my buddies, and I've seen them just flip over in general. So they made it wider. You can see that the width is up 4.1 inches to the exact same width as the new R. They've also made bigger shocks. The wheel travel is a lot bigger. So you see the wheel travel is actually a little better than the 2023R. I'm not really sure what's going on there. Maybe this is how they measured it, but it's about the same. Width's the same. Ground clearance is the same. Weight's up a lot because there's two more seats, obviously. And now let's talk about the wheelbase. So this is kind of interesting. So if you look at the wheelbase here, 118 inches. And why do I say that's interesting? Well, if you go over and you look at the difference between the old X, like so say the XS and the RS, there was a 5-inch difference in wheelbase. That's why these are highlighted yellow to remind me to talk about this. But now if you look at the difference between the wheelbase of the R4 and the X4, there's only like a 2-inch difference in wheelbase, a 2.5-inch difference in wheelbase, let's say that. So what's going on here? Well, what this indicates is that this new R4 uses the new suspension geometry that they put on the 2023R, which makes sense, right? So if we look at this wheelbase, we've got 90 and we've got 87.6. That's a pretty similar delta to these two. So it looks like they took the same X4 frame and they slapped on the 2023 R suspension. So you don't get that 5-inch growth in wheelbase, which is great because that would be obnoxious on a 4-seater Talon R. And now you get to my big takeaway from this video. I do not think that Honda made the 2023 R shorter just for the sake of the R. I think they did that so they could throw that same suspension on the R4 and not make the R4 too long. And I'm worried that that is going to sacrifice performance on the 2023R. Honda loves to do this. They love to make a change and then apply it to a bunch of different models to save production costs and engineering costs. And sometimes it sucks. So I think the 2023 R4 is going to be great. And I think because they're trying to keep commonality between their platforms, the 2023 R is going to suffer, especially in the high-speed whoop type thing or when you're jumping it. That shorter wheelbase is going to make the back end pop up in the air even more. That's just my opinion. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I have had a few of these models, and I do know a little bit about suspension. And I've had every Honda known to man, so that's generally what Honda does. Is they take the conservative approach. What I would have loved them to do is make some bespoke suspension for the X4R, excuse me, the 2023 R4, and that's great. And then make the 4-seater or the 2-seater R even longer and put a sharper angle steering rack in it to get your turning radius to be decent, but whatever. Let's talk about the turning radius on this live valve 2023 R4 real quick. So 22.6 isn't that bad. It's only a little over a foot worse than the original Talon R, and it's way longer, right? So that's pretty cool that they were able to keep the turning radius decent. And again, that's that new suspension, the new R suspension, and some tweaks to um, the steering box, the steering rack. And just real quick, just to mention it, both of these have a longer wheelbase than a Land Cruiser. So these things are incredibly long, and we have had them get bellied out on some trails, and it's caused some pretty serious issues and caused some damage to the bottom of them when they're just constantly smashing the belly into whoops and stuff like that and rocks. So if I had a 4-seater, I'd definitely put a pretty heavy-duty skid plate on it because that belly is going to be dragging a lot. Anyways, those are the updates I've noticed reading through the Honda literature and looking at the specs that are now available online. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know which one you would buy. Um, I'm excited about the changes. I'm most excited about the Showa shocks and the non-live valve. I really don't like the shorter R. Just to reiterate that, I think Honda was being lazy there. And which one am I going to get? Well, it depends which one I can get my hand on first. I'm going to get one of these, and I'm also really shopping hard for that new Can-Am XMR ATV, a single cylinder. So I want to try that as well. One big letdown, of course, is all of these still use the stupid four-wheel drive. They don't have a front locker. So anyone I buy, I've got to put a torque locker in it regardless. Maybe Honda will throw a Pioneer front diff in one of these one day for people that actually, like to be in control of the driving. But you know how it goes. Everything gets more and more automatic to make it more and more user friendly.